How can we learn from the past?
It is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
It's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
evil,
illogical,
xenophobic,
genocide,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
I think it was for many, many years a beckoning subject, something we had to deal with, something we had to confront as filmmakers of American history.
This is a story in which everyone is challenged all the time. We're challenged as Americans, we're challenged as parents, as children, to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done. Even though the Holocaust physically took place in Europe, it is a story that Americans have to reckon with too.
Why would we want to go back and look at this dark, dark time? But the opportunity to look at it through the perspective of what does it mean for America and Americans was an opportunity we just couldn't pass up.
Part of our national mythology is that we are a good people, we are a democracy. And we are a democracy. And in our better moments, we are very good people. But that's not all there is to this story.
We have interviews from scholars and writers who have studied the story, but there's just really nothing like speaking to someone who lived through it and hearing their story directly told to you.
My father explained if we're in two different places, the chance that two of us will survive is bigger. So that was the first time that I really realized it's a matter of life and death.
These are important events in American history that need to be understood now and 5 years from now. Every generation deserves to look at the defining moments of the human experience and try to understand them for the present.
This story is beyond our comprehension. It's horrifying. I won't work on a more important film in my professional life.
How can we learn from the past?
It is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
it's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
Threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
evil,
illogical,
xenophobic,
genocide,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
How can we learn from the past?
it is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
it's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
Threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
evil,
illogical,
xenophobic,
genocide,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
I think it was for many, many years a beckoning subject, something we had to deal with, something we had to confront as filmmakers of American history.
This is a story in which everyone is challenged all the time. We're challenged as Americans, we're challenged as parents, as children, to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done. Even though the Holocaust physically took place in Europe, it is a story that Americans have to reckon with too.
Why would we want to go back and look at this dark, dark time? But the opportunity to look at it through the perspective of what does it mean for America and Americans was an opportunity we just couldn't pass up.
Part of our national mythology is that we are a good people, we are a democracy. And we are a democracy, and in our better moments, we are very good people. But that's not all there is to this story.
We have interviews from scholars and writers who have studied the story, but there's just really nothing like speaking to someone who lived through it and hearing their story directly told to you.
My father explained if we're in two different places, the chance that two of us will survive is bigger. So that was the first time that I really realized it's a matter of life and death.
These are important events in American history that need to be understood now and 5 years from now. Every generation deserves to look at the defining moments of the human experience and try to understand them for the present.
This story is beyond our comprehension. It's horrifying. I won't work on a more important film in my professional life.
How can we learn from the past?
It is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
It's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
Threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
evil,
illogical,
xenophobic,
Genocide,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
How can we learn from the past?
it is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
It's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
Threatening, shocking,
unbelievable,
evil,
illogical,
xenophobic,
Genocide,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to this story.
think it was for many, many years a beckoning subject, something we had to deal with, something we had to confront as filmmakers of American history.
This is a story in which everyone is challenged all the time. We're challenged as Americans, we're challenged as parents, as children, to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done. Even though the Holocaust physically took place in Europe, it is a story that Americans have to reckon with too.
Why would we want to go back and look at this dark, dark time? But the opportunity to look at it through the perspective of what does it mean for America and Americans was an opportunity we just couldn't pass up.
Part of our national mythology is that we are a good people. We are a democracy. And we are a democracy. And in our better moments, we are very good people. But that's not all there is to the story.
We have interviews from scholars and writers who have studied the story, but there's just really nothing like speaking to someone who lived through it and hearing their story directly told to you.
My father explained if we're in two different places, the chance that two of us will survive is bigger. So that was the first time that I really realized it's a matter of life and death.
These are important events in American history that need to be understood now and 5 years from now. Every generation deserves to look at the defining moments of the human experience and try to understand them for the present.
This story is beyond our comprehension. It's horrifying. I won't work on a more important film in my professional life.
How can we learn from the past?
It is a story that Americans are challenged with all the time.
It's haunting, cruel,
Tragic,
Threatening, shocking,
unbelievable.
evil,
illogical,
Xenophobic,
genocidal,
danger, death. But that's not all there is to the story.
How can we learn from the past?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Cynthia Hunt. I'm the program director for the, not the program director, I'm the program specialist for the Amarillo Public Library and the program director for Americans and the Holocaust. The film clips you've been watching while waiting for today's presentation to begin were taken from the new Ken Burns documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, and I have been asked to say a few words about this documentary on behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. This is the same stuff I've been saying every week, so if you've been here before, try to stay awake, we'll get through it together. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is honored that the Americans in the Holocaust exhibition inspired Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein to produce a new documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. The film was produced solely by Florentine Films. Like the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition, the film explores what Americans knew about the persecution and murder of the Jews and how they responded. It will make an important contribution to our understanding of both Holocaust and American history. The museum was pleased to cooperate with the filmmakers by providing archival and historical sources and expertise in support of the film. Now, on to some housekeeping. We are recording today's presentation for use later on the library's YouTube channel. So if you could, please take a moment now to either turn off your film so we don't get interrupted by Amber Alerts, or at least turn the volume down all the way. Yes, I'm going to stare at you until you do it. Go ahead. Now, let's see. If you do have a call you simply must take, please answer it in a low voice by saying, "Hold, please," then go out the door at the back of the room that is open and get around a corner before you start talking. That'll make it more enjoyable for people to enjoy this presentation and for the people who watch the future recording to enjoy it more as well. Modern Perspectives of the Holocaust, which is what we're here for today, is a lecture series assembled by the Amarillo Public Library. Each of the presentations in this series has been carefully chosen by the library and then vetted by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and are designed to enhance and deepen your understanding of one or more themes contained within the Americans in the Holocaust traveling exhibition, which we are currently hosting across the street at the downtown library. The Modern Perspectives on the Holocaust series has been made possible in part by the Friends of the Amarillo Public Library, the Amarillo Civic Center Complex, Panhandle PBS, the American Library Association, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Education Credit Union. Today's presentation, American Eyewitnesses to the Nazi Rise to Power, is being presented by Andrew Nagorski, an award-winning journalist and author. He spent over 3 decades as a foreign correspondent and editor for Newsweek Magazine. He also served as Newsweek's bureau chief in Hong Kong, Rome, Bonn, Berlin, Warsaw, and Moscow. He now lives in St. Augustine, Florida, but continues to travel extensively while writing for numerous publications. He is the author of 8 books so far, including Hitlerland, America's Eyewitnesses to the Nazi Rise to Power, The Nazi Hunters, and his latest book, Saving Freud, The Rescuers Who Brought Him to Freedom, which is receiving rave reviews. Following today's presentation and the Q&A session, he'll be signing books. If you didn't bring one of his books with you, Burrowing Owl Books is selling some here for you today, so you can buy one or more of them for him to sign, and hint, hint, they make great gifts for your history buffs in your life. But that's after you hear about America's Eyewitnesses to the Nazi Rise to Power from Andrew Nagorski. So on that note, let's give you Andrew Nagorski.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. As Cynthia mentioned, I've spent a lot of my time as professionally for Newsweek, and that meant out of the country most of the time. And so I love opportunities like this to get to parts of the country I haven't been to. I have to confess, my only knowledge of Amarillo is George Strait. And I love that song. It's a great song, but it's nice to broaden your horizons a little bit. I think it's pretty obvious if you're here that you're here because there is a compelling reason why we should be constantly re-examining this period. And just curiosity, a show of hands, how many of you had somebody in your family, probably back a generation or two, who was either in World War II, and somehow caught up in the Holocaust or in the associated events? Yeah, that's what I figured. Pretty much everybody, and everybody's got a personal story and connection, and of course, all of that changed the trajectory of so many lives. Just by way of background, my own story is that my parents grew up in Poland before World War II. They were married in 1938, right on the eve of the war. In 1939, my father was called up in the Polish army. He fought against the Germans when Germany invaded, which was the beginning of World War II. He was, by the way, he was in charge of a tank platoon, which the Polish army at that time had World War I French tanks, which had a maximum speed of about 5 miles per hour. So as he said, when they faced the Panzers, it was a pretty short battle. And then he and a buddy decided, when they were ordered to be turned into, the Germans said they should turn themselves into POW camps. When the occupation began, they decided to flee. He was lucky. He managed to escape, mostly on foot, jumping trains, all these things which he just talked about as if it was no big deal, and got first to Hungary, then Yugoslavia, eventually to France, while France was still a free country, and Polish units regrouped there. And then the British not only evacuated their own troops from Dunkirk and other ports, they also evacuated Polish troops there, including my father's unit. And so he ended up in the UK, serving with a Polish unit based in Scotland. Stayed there a couple years after the war. My mother had managed to tag along. And I was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. That's why I'm Andrew. My thick Scottish accent is because I left when I was about 10 months old. But yeah, and then from there they ended up coming to the States because there was no returning to Poland when it became a communist country, and my father and grandfather were involved in what was called the Polish government in exile, which was the anti-communist government. So I think any number of stories, I'm sure within any number of families, get to the various turns of history and the impact on those families for those who were lucky enough to survive. And my father and mother always said they were incredibly lucky to have survived. They don't know how that happened, but of course so many did not. And as a journalist, when I was based in places like Berlin and Moscow and Warsaw, I kept finding myself covering stories about the legacy of the war, the legacy of the Holocaust, talking to survivors, to veterans who survived. And there were controversies constantly about how do you remember this past? How do you deal with this past? In Germany, of course, how do you come to terms with that past? And in fact, sometimes there are, of course, all the traumatic stories of children of survivors, but there's some pretty traumatic stories of children of perpetrators. What if you discover your father was a war criminal or ran a concentration camp? So these are all, I think our fascination with this period has to do with things which are not just about this particular period in time, but about human psychology, human behavior, and how was it possible that much of these things happened in the first place? How is it possible that someone like Hitler came to power, and then so many people followed him? So this was something that first, as a journalist, I found myself touching on in many ways. And I kept thinking, there's so many stories I get. I, for instance, interview survivor in 1995, Newsweek, we did a cover story about the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And we decided to reconstruct the last 6 months of that horrible camp and what happened to people and the death marches and so forth. So I went around interviewing survivors from all over, from not just from Poland, but Holland, France, and it was you got all these stories, and you then wrote a story which was pretty long for Newsweek, but you realized you left out so much. and these stories need to be told. And in fact, so what the Holocaust Museum, I think, is preserving those stories. And by the way, I gave the tapes of those interviews to the Holocaust Museum. They are there now. And I talked to also some of the liberators of Auschwitz, some of the who were from the Red Army in Moscow. So I feel that as both a journalist and then more of a historian, trying to get those histories, telling those histories, and constantly revisit those histories is crucial. And in the beginning, though, I was a little wary about writing books about this period because there have been so many very formidable histories and biographies. I remember I was once on a panel, I think it was in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Times had a panel of historians, and they had one guy who'd written about the Revolutionary War, George Washington, another who wrote about the Civil War, another who wrote about World War I, and I was supposed to talk about writing about World War II. And the first guy says, you know, it's really hard as an author. What do you say about George Washington, the founding fathers of the Revolutionary War? There are all these books on the subject, and he goes on about this. Then the next guy, well, what about the Civil War, Lincoln, and so forth? You feel you're in a very crowded field. And then World War I, Woodrow Wilson, the Treaty of Versailles. And it got to me, I said, well, yeah, that's all true, but have you ever heard of this guy called Hitler? There have been a few books about him too, but that doesn't mean that there aren't new ways of looking at it. And in fact, I became very interested early on about the Americans in Germany and what they viewed. This was even before this Holocaust Museum exhibition. And in fact, when I first wrote my book, then some of the people involved in that asked me to speak about it. And I was thinking, in all of these books, I'm trying to look at history not sort of from 30,000 feet, but for how it was lived by people. What did people see? What did people understand? Much less, only then do you get to the question of how did they behave and what choices did they make? Because it's easy, you're looking in retrospect to say, oh, I would have understood what was happening. I would have done this or that. When you put yourself in the middle of those events and see how it looked to people at the time, it's not so clear, even with something like the rise of the Nazis. And part of that was based on my experiences, for instance, reporting from Moscow in the 80s when it was still the Soviet Union, the Cold War. In those days, if someone had said to me, in 1989, the Berlin Wall is going to fall, 1991, the Soviet Union is going to collapse, yeah, I might have believed it, I might have not. I did have the impression that this system, absurd system, has to collapse at some point, but none of us are prophets, and it's much easier to understand history in retrospect. And so what I'm trying to do in these books is to tell the stories as it looked at the time, and especially in Hitlerland. But even in my latest book, Saving Freud, that's the case. I try to put it through the perspective of Sigmund Freud in Vienna and his friends. And by the way, because I ended up writing, after being reluctant to, several books on this period focused on the Nazis and on Hitler, sometimes book review editors and others refer to me as the Hitler guy, which is sort of a mixed feeling. So I'm glad I'm glad I'm now can be the Freud guy occasionally. It's a much better designation. Anyway, so then the question is, how does one get these materials and how to be able to tell these stories? And here's where we get to what the first-hand accounts. As a reporter, I always wanted to interview people who were involved in events. And that's ideal. And I did a few years ago in my earlier books about World War II, I still managed to interview a lot of people directly involved in World War II on various sides of both sides, both the German side, the Soviet side, the Polish side, British side. But it gets harder to do. So where do you get the material, especially when I wanted to write about Americans in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and thinking, well, a little bit from the perspective of, if I had been an American correspondent in Germany at the time, rather than in the 80s and 90s when I was there, what would my life have been like? What would I have seen and heard? So first of all, I love getting firsthand accounts from that period, which can be letters, diaries, things in archives and family collections. I've used extensively the Hoover Archives at Stanford, the Library of Congress, other places, where you get an immediate sense of how people lived and what they understood when they were doing it. And with Sigmund Freud, who wrote letters all the time, reading those letters, it's a totally different experience than what I'm afraid future historians will have, which is future historians who will have to rely on emails and text messages or whatever other form of electronic messages, which do not give anywhere a kind of the richness of descriptions and care that as often went into writing letters and memoirs. And so I would find things like, and particularly valuable were unpublished or forgotten memoirs in family archives. Just one example, when I was researching these Americans in Europe, I discovered that in the 1930s there was a young U.S. diplomat by the name of Jacob Beam in the Berlin U.S. Embassy in Berlin. And Jacob Beam, I knew, had been a U.S. ambassador in Eastern Europe after the war, and I happened to know his son, who was a journalistic colleague in Moscow at one point. And so I had no idea he'd served in Berlin as a junior diplomat. So I called my friend in Boston, his son Alex. I said, listen, I just discovered your father was in Berlin then during the rise of Hitler. Did he write anything about it? And he said, well, yeah, he tried to write a book about it. It wasn't very good. It never got published. I said, Alex, do you have a manuscript? He said, oh, it's somewhere in my attic. I said, get it out of the attic. Go to wherever, copy it. I'll pay you back. Send me a copy. And of course, it wasn't great as a book, but it had wonderful firsthand anecdotes. And those kinds of things are invaluable. So let me explain with this period. I know the focus is on the Holocaust, but I think you cannot focus on the Holocaust without understanding Hitler's rise to power, the general atmosphere in Germany and Europe, and to a certain extent in the United States then. And you have to put it, all of these things have a larger context. And that's what I was trying to understand. And I'll start by saying it also has to do a lot with personalities. Of course, Hitler is the largest personality in terms of a negative personality. And the reason, by the way, this book is called Hitlerland, it's not some fantasy of mine, and it certainly has nothing to do with a place in Anaheim, California, or wherever it is, at Disneyland. It was the journalists in the 30s, who were American journalists, began to refer to, among themselves, not in print, to this country they were covering as Hitlerland, because everything was about Hitler. And so, but how did Hitlerland ever happen? And it's worth remembering that coming out of World War I, our views, what Germany was and how the U.S. viewed Germany was very different than what most people assume today. Germany had, after World War I, was a defeated country. It was economically on its knees. There was hyperinflation and all that. And in fact, people were incredibly demoralized. The hyperinflation was such that there was a story that they were printing money so fast that you would get whatever money you received in pay, and you would rush to a store to buy something before it became worthless. And there was a story in Berlin of a woman who had literally a wheelbarrow full of cash. And the problem was that the stores would be emptied out right away. She goes in front of the store with her wheelbarrow full of cash and rushes in to see if something's there to buy, rushes out, and the wheelbarrow is still, the cash is all scattered on the street, and the wheelbarrow is gone. That was the thing that was worth something. So this, you have to understand the desperation of people who see the life savings gone, and you don't even have the satisfaction of that, oh, this war made any sense, because it obviously didn't. Germany was defeated and humiliated. And as a result, you have all these radical movements coming up. It's not just the Nazis at that point, which are a tiny party. They're the Bolshevik, they're the communist parties. The Bolshevik Revolution has just taken place in Russia. Extreme parties of the right and left. But at the same time, you have the Americans who are there, and they find Germany after World War I a very welcoming place. One reason is, even though Americans had joined in fighting Germany in World War I, it was right at the end in 1917. And the main attribute of the Americans, as far as the Germans was concerned, was that they were not the French. The French were seen as the bad guys, vindictive guys who wanted to humiliate the Germans. The Americans came in late, they wanted to have a peace deal, and whatever its failings, it was a sense that this was a place that we should help get it back on its feet. But the Americans came, and Berlin was this incredible place in the 1920s where there was an explosion of the arts. It was because it was chaotic, politically chaotic, economically dismal. But as Americans, if you had hard currency, you had a lot of money. You could go anywhere, do anything. And there were a lot of people who were really creative, who were on the scene. There was Bertolt Brecht, the playwright. There was Marlene Dietrich in their movies, and the Americans were meeting people like that. Albert Einstein wanders into American parties in those days. And George Grosz, the painter. And so everything, it feels like a glamorous place in some ways. And there was this anything goes atmosphere of Berlin that in terms of sexual practices, it made the 1960s look pretty tame. It was, whether it was straight or gay, Philip Johnson, a famous American gay architect, said that he felt for the first time like a liberated young man in Berlin. And in terms of, some of you have heard of Josephine Baker, who was the star in Paris, a black singer, and had her whole group of black singers in Paris who were all the rage in Paris. She brought her group of black singers over to Berlin for a series of shows. And she, even though there were already racist protests, and some of the Nazis were protesting against her, a lot of Berliners, welcomed her and invited her to parties, and she was very popular. Also, she danced in her loincloth, so that made her quite popular. And she said, Berlin nightlife has had an intensity Paris doesn't know. And one of the early journalists there, Edgar Ansel Maurer, who, by the way, is talked about in that Holocaust film, said at the time, he was in Berlin, he was assigned in Germany first in the 20s, and then he watched the rise of Hitler. But in the 20s, when he's there, he said, it is hard to conceive of a much more tolerant society. When you think about what's going to happen next, it's an extraordinary thing to contemplate. And it tells you that the path of history, again, is not a straight path. And you had an amazing cast of characters, American characters, who go through there. Everyone wants to come to Berlin. Writers like Sinclair Lewis, Thomas Wolfe, and then diplomats like George Kennan, who becomes famous mostly as a diplomat on Russia. You had young journalists like Howard K. Smith, who later became an ABC anchor. And even the young John F. Kennedy, after his freshman year at Harvard, comes to Germany with a friend, and they go driving around Germany. His diary is not that interesting in some ways because he seems focused on what he calls the young German bundle of fun who joined us on this trip. But he has observations about Germany and what a great place it was. And you had jazz scene and all that. But at the same time, you have the rise of radicals. And one of them, of course, is a radical World War I veteran called Adolf Hitler. And one of the things I wanted to figure out early was, who were the Americans who met Hitler before he was known as really to the outside world? And what did they think of him? And there were two. There was a guy called Henry von Wiegand, who was a German-born. He was born in Germany, came over to the States as a child. He was on a farm in Iowa somewhere, ran away from home, was a real adventurer. He claimed to have actually worked for Buffalo Bill for a while. And he shows up on the West Coast and starts writing for newspapers and because he speaks German, gets sent to Germany, reports on Germany before World War I, and then stays on and becomes a senior correspondent for the Hearst newspaper. And in 1922, when Mussolini comes to power, and he's the first fascist leader who comes to power, and this guy Van Wiegand thinks maybe there are other kind of mini Mussolinis, somebody in Germany who could be like him, who will represent this idea of fascism. And he hears about this guy who's going around beer halls in Munich called Hitler, and he goes and observes him. And he writes the first stories about Hitler that really that Americans can read. And he describes him as a magnetic speaker, having also exceptional organizing genius. He's the German Mussolini. And just a very brief description, because most of the time, the descriptions of Hitler we see him ranting in those movie clips. We have high-pitched. But this is the way von Wiegand described him. Age 34, medium, tall, wiry, slender, dark eyes, cropped toothbrush mustache, eyes that seem at times to spurt fire, straight nose, finely chiseled features, with a complexion so remarkably delicate that many a woman would be proud to possess it. By the way, this is a theme that often comes out, that he's seen somehow as a little feminine, and possessing a bearing that creates an impression of dynamic energy well under control. That is Hitler, one of the most interesting characters I've met in many months. He has the earmarks of a leader, whether it be merely a band or a great movement, only the future will tell. So even right early on, some Americans spotted Hitler as that he's on the rise. That doesn't mean they approved of him, but then another American, a guy who's a junior military attaché in Berlin, goes to report on Hitler after reading von Wiegand's story, and he meets with Hitler. His name is Truman Smith, and he's a straight U.S. Army guy, and he calls Hitler, he meets with him, he says he's a marvelous demagogue. He's not saying marvelous in a way, again, approving. He's just that he's got real talent. I have rarely listened to such a logical and fanatical man. His power over the mob must be immense. So you have people who are immediately, there's not an immediate consensus that Hitler is necessarily a danger, although they sense that there is a potential danger. And then you even have some people who admire him, some of the Americans. There was one of his first propagandist was a man by the name of Ernst Hanstengel, Putzi, he was his nickname. He had a German father and an American mother from Boston, had gone to Harvard in the class of 1909, was a very entertaining guy, played the piano well, became friends with the son of Teddy Roosevelt, was even invited to the White House, and he marries a woman, an American woman, but whose parents came from Germany. Her name's Helen. After World War I, they come to Munich and settle in Munich, and they get to know Hitler, and Ernst becomes his propagandist and observes him very closely and explains that when Hitler speaks, he manages to arouse the crowd very gradually. He first talks softly about all the day-to-day stuff that's irritating people. The fact that you can't put food on the table because money is worthless. The fact that we've been humiliated by our enemies. And then he gradually works up to a crescendo. He said, it's quite a performance. And this is something that later on is not understood often. And then there's a story of Helen, his wife, whom Hitler's relationship with women is a whole separate subject, and his fascination with young women and alleged perversions, all that. I'm not going to get into that there, but Helen was one of the few women about his age who Hitler seemed genuinely mesmerized by. And what happens, and I think there's a lesson here about the role of chance and the role of individuals in history. First of all, in 1923, when the Nazi Party, which Hitler is leading, is very small still in Munich, Hitler decides to lead his followers to try to overthrow the government in Bavaria. Munich is the capital of Bavaria, and then maybe march to Berlin. He thinks, well, I've got a lot of people who sympathize with me. There's so much frustration. This will be easy. They'll never fire at me. Well, in fact, when he marches, much to his amazement, the police open fire and kill several Nazis, including his close aide, who is marching arm in arm with Hitler, who gets shot and drops to the ground and yanks Hitler down and actually dislocates his shoulder. And one of the things, big what-ifs of history is, what if that bullet's trajectory in 1923 had been slightly different? These are these kind of what-if moments you say, God, the whole history of the 20th century might have been different. I'm not saying Hitler was the only one, and there were plenty of other would-be dictators and totalitarian figures, but it turned out, I'm convinced, that Hitler was the one person who could unify and be fanatic enough to inspire the fanaticism of so many people, that Germany might have still turned into a dictatorship without Hitler, but I don't think it would have turned into the Third Reich to be on that scale. And therefore, would there have ever been a Holocaust? I don't know. That doesn't mean that there weren't plenty of willing accomplices to Hitler. But the role of the individual there, and one other bit, just to say, the role of American individuals, this Helen Homstangl, after Hitler is wounded and the police is rounding up the people who did this, Hitler jumps into a car with his bodyguards and a doctor, and they're looking for a place to escape. And they decide to go to the Homstangls. They had a house outside of Munich, to go there. Ernst, the husband, had already fled into Austria nearby, and Helen is at home. And Hitler comes in all shaken up, and he's in despair. He said, my whole political future is gone. Our movement has been shattered. And at one point, and then Helen gets word from someone down the street, the police is coming to arrest Hitler. And she tells Hitler this. And Hitler is in despair, and he's got a pistol in his hand. And Helen, at that point, grabs the pistol and says, "What are you doing? What are you thinking about doing?" your follower, you have to still follow. Yeah, she was a true believer at that point. You have to be true to your followers. And she was convinced he was trying to commit suicide. You can't say for sure, but to imagine that an American woman might have prevented Hitler from committing suicide again in 1923, it's a staggering thought. But that's all in much more detail in the book. But then there's the question of really what did we know and what did we understand and what did these Americans know? First of all, after Hitler then goes to prison, he only serves 11 months. He had a 5-year sentence, but a lot of people are sympathizing with him in Bavaria, and they let him go. But he seems to have really, his moment has passed. He has a trial where he makes a bit of a splash. But then in the mid-20s, Germany seems to stabilize economically, a lot of it with American support, by the way, American loans and so forth. Again, many Americans are trying to help Germany get back on its feet. And during that time, support for the Nazi movement is really low. In 1928, the elections, the Nazis got something under 3% of the vote for parliament, for the German parliament. Then 1929 happens, the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, and everything goes to pieces in Germany as well. And suddenly support for the Nazis shoots way up. First they're the second largest party, then they're the largest party. And that's when Hitler is offered the chancellorship. And at this point, but even then, people are underestimating Hitler, including the Americans. Dorothy Thompson, who was the most famous American correspondent, female correspondent of that era, had been in and out of Germany, and she, in 1931, asked for an interview with Hitler. She had never met him, and he gave rare interviews, and she sees him as the future chancellor of Germany. And she thinks she's going to do this big feature for Cosmopolitan magazine about the future leader of Germany. And she says, I walked into the room, and within 90 seconds, I realized he's never going to be the leader of Germany. It's impossible to imagine. Here's what she wrote. He is inconsequent and voluble, ill-poised, insecure. He's a prototype of the little man. His eyes have the most peculiar shine, which often distinguishes geniuses, alcoholics, and hysterics. At the same time, he has the soft, almost feminine charm of the Austrian. He'll be no match for the real politicians. Oh, Adolf, she writes, you will be out of luck. So, you see, here he is on the brink of taking power, and one of the best journalists of that era gets it all wrong. Now, to her credit, and as a journalist, I would say, we can all make mistakes, but it's a question of at what point do you recognize the mistakes. When he took power, she quickly recognized her mistakes. He went back to Germany, reported very firmly about how bad things were. And one of the things she really got right was about anti-Semitism in the Nazi program. She said, Nazism, everything about the Nazi Party and Hitler has to do with anti-Semitism. You take out the anti-Semitism from the Nazi program, and there's no program, there's no ideology. And unlike, say, the communists who had this whole, however absurd, but convoluted theories of Marxism, the Nazis were largely resentment and anti-Semitism. And she understood that. She went back, she wrote some really hard-hitting reports and got expelled from Germany very soon thereafter. Something which I can identify with since I was expelled from the Soviet Union also. So I think if you're doing your job in those countries, you're likely to get into trouble. But there were some people who really figured it out early. And Edgar Maurer, this guy who wrote about how tolerant a society was in the 20s, also was one of the earliest ones who realized the danger that Hitler represented. He was writing for the Chicago Tribune, and he the Chicago Daily News, and he wrote very hard-hitting reports saying, this guy's a danger. And in fact, he was also telling his Jewish friends in Berlin, take this seriously, because many Jews in Germany, very well educated. Germany had many well-educated, assimilated Jews. And one of the things people don't understand is, for instance, in Germany, the population of Jews in the 30s, in the beginning of the 30s anyway, was about 500,000. So it's not by far the largest Jewish population in Europe. And many of them were very assimilated. Germany had been pretty selective in how many Jews they accepted in earlier ages. Poland, by example, for instance, had more than 3 million Jews, the largest Jewish population in Europe. But there have been waves earlier who came, and there was not the same kind of demand about what, people bringing a certain amount of wealth or position or privilege. And that's why the largest group of Jews was in Poland, and that's why, frankly, Hitler later put most of his concentration camps there, because that's where most of them were or could be brought to. Anyway, Maurer, as a reporter, I found it fascinating the way he operated. He, again, in the Soviet Union, you had to play various games with the KGB, how to elude them, how to meet with sources. And Maurer, as things was getting worse for the Jews, had worked things out that his source, who was the son of one of Berlin's chief rabbis, would come to a dentist they both used, and he would pass along a note, something about what was happening to the Jewish community, who was arrested, who was deported, and he would give it to the dentist. Then Maurer would say, "Oh, I've got a toothache," and go in to see this dentist and get it from the dentist who was cooperating. When that became too dangerous, they actually arranged Maurer and the son of the rabbi to meet in an underground toilet in Berlin under Potsdamer Platz, the main square, and they'd be at different urinals, and they'd walk out, and this guy would drop a note so that Maurer could pick up. So people had to go to extraordinary lengths to get information. But at the same time, Hitler was saying things that should have been obvious. We are why Jews need to be exterminated. And by the way, Slavs, Poles, and others, and Russians were considered inferior, and they need to be enslaved. So all these things were there, but people were often found it hard to believe. People in Germany, and that's why many Jews stayed, and people abroad. And in a way, it is no accident, because, I mean, if somebody says, I'm going to kill all of this group of people, and it just seems so far beyond the irrational mind that people find it hard to believe. So a large part of the story that's being told here is about people coming to terms with it. Howard K. Smith, the future TV anchor, said, who lived in Germany then as a young AP correspondent, said there were 4 stages of people, foreigners, Americans and others, when they came to Nazi Germany. First stage, they come in and say, oh, they've got all this bad press, but everything's so nicely organized. There are flowers up on the balcony. People are courteous and all. This is a nice place. The second stage is they begin to notice, oh, there are a lot of uniforms here and marching bands and all that. And some people say, well, it's kind of exciting. It's sort of, this sense of pride. The third stage was saying, oh, my God, all these folks with guns and uniforms, they're being trained to kill, and trained to kill any number of people and to attack. And the fourth stage is complete panic and saying, we've got to tell the world, get ready for them. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the people some people would go from that first stage to the fourth stage very quickly. Some would go no further than second or third. Some would become alarmed and then become less alarmed. It wasn't a linear thing. And again, we tend to think everyone should have known. That's not the case. And just as an example, example, and again, this is not the Americans, but getting to Freud, here was a man who was considered the preeminent person of understanding of human psychology. He was born in 1856. In the 30s, he was already in his late 70s, early 80s. He was ill, but he wrote about totalitarian. He was not a political person, but he wrote about the capacity of man for what he called bestiality of man and aggression. And yet, he was ensconced in Vienna, which was at that point still an independent country. It had a fascist government in the 30s, but nothing like the Nazis. And he kept thinking, this will pass me by. I can live out the rest of my life without this. And even when his friends tried to get him out, he kept insisting, no, no, no. He was also ill at that point. He had jaw cancer from his famous cigar smoking. And it took this whole, what I call a rescue squad, to get him out, to convince him to get out. And then he stayed until Hitler was literally down the street making a speech about how Austria was disappearing as a state and was going to become part of Germany, the Anschluss. And it took a major operation of his friends, who included, by the way, people like Marie Bonaparte, the great-grandniece of Napoleon, William Bullitt, the U.S. ambassador to France, and a whole host of characters who managed to get him out. That's the story of saving Freud. And then to convince the British to give him entry permits, because another part of course, about the Holocaust is that it was not only escaping from the Third Reich, but where do you escape to? And even someone as famous as Freud, it was not automatic that he'd get in. It wasn't for the fact that there was a Welsh physician who was one of his earliest followers, who has all sorts of good London connections, that he got entry permits for Sigmund Freud and his family and his entourage. So all along the way, there's disbelief. And even, let me give you one more example of that disbelief. As late as 1942, remember, this is the 20s, 30s, the Holocaust hasn't started yet. Officially, usually the Holocaust, there's been killing, there's been persecution, there's been really horrible things, but the mass murder of Jews starts in earnest in 1941. And in 1942, there was a courier for the Polish resistance, the Polish underground, a man by the name of Jan Karski. The Poles had a lot of resistance groups, and he had been a diplomat and then was a courier. And I interviewed him later on, before he died in 2001. He had a mission to get out of Poland, smuggle his way through Germany, which was an incredible saga in and of itself, and get to London and then to Washington. And he succeeded to do that. And when he got to London in 1942, he saw major figures such as Anthony Eden, the foreign minister, the head of the intelligence services. And he would tell them not about everything that was going on, how the whole Polish population was being treated and the mass executions, but particularly what was happening with the Jews. He had been, before he left Poland, he got himself smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto so he could see for himself, and even into one of the concentration camps. He was an incredibly courageous man. And so he had seen firsthand. He wanted to be able to tell people firsthand. And he met with one of the heads of MI6, the British intelligence arm, and told him all these stories. And basically this guy said, well, good job, young man. You're presenting your case forcefully, but I remember how in World War I there were all these exaggerated stories about how German soldiers were bayoneting babies in Belgium, and that was good for propaganda purposes. And the implication was this can't really be true. And Karski gets to Washington, and he gets to see top officials like Felix Frankfurter, who was on the Supreme Court, a Jewish member of the Supreme Court, and tells him the same thing, what he witnessed, just what he witnessed. And Frankfurter tells him, well, Mr. Karski, again, I applaud your courage and your daring in getting this story out, but I can't believe it. And the Polish ambassador in Washington, when we said, why, you've got to believe it. This is eyewitness stuff. He said, you can't say, he's not lying. I'm not saying he's a liar. I just can't believe it. He did not, people found it very hard to believe. And he even got into the White House, had about a half-hour meeting with Roosevelt, in which Roosevelt talked about the war, and Nagorski delivered his warning about the Holocaust, and basically FDR's answer was, we're going to win the war. That's the way we end the Holocaust. Well, as we know, the Holocaust played itself out. Most of the Holocaust played itself out well before the war ended. So there are countless stories of this period that still need to be told. And some of them are very, even in these dark times, some of them are very uplifting, I'd say, because of the courage. I'll give you one more example. You have people who collaborated with the Germans, but a lot of people just didn't understand. But you had some people who were very courageous, like this journalist from Chicago. There was an American woman who had married a German aristocrat before World War I, so she was still living in Germany in the 30s when the Nazis took power. And there was a scene where she is at a dinner party in the 30s, and there are several Nazis, and she's sitting there with one of the Nazis, and she asks him, I hear that some Jews in Germany can be designated honorary Germans. And this Nazi says, yes, that can happen. In other words, we might make exceptions with some Jews. And she asks him, and there was a table full of witnesses to it, including, by the way, the father of this friend of mine who was a diplomat, who said, then she asked him, how can I become an honorary Jew? You can imagine how that went over with the Nazis. So there were people who really understood what was happening and were very courageous. But the more I write about this period, about the people in it and what they experienced, the more I'm very hesitant to say, what would I have known? What would I have understood? Much less, how would I behave? And you get into the issue of who would you have been willing to risk yourself, your family, and everybody else to save other people, strangers. So I think it is these questions, these issues are peculiar to that period, but also have an application in terms of sort of testing our own selves. And I hope you'll continue these discussions. I'm delighted that this exhibition is here, and I saw it over at the library. It's very, very well done, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or take any remarks. Thank you.
Okay, so if any of you would like to ask Andrew Nagorski any questions, please hold up your hand. As one question gets asked, I'll bring the microphone over to you. You ask your question, and once Andy starts answering that question, hold up your hand if you have a different question, and I will come over to you so that we don't lose a lot of time having me run over for the next question. Anybody got any questions? Okay. Yes, we have a question. Keep your hand up. Yay. Anybody else have a question? Get your hand up as soon as he starts answering.
I have a question about the American media. Mm-hmm. What did they portray to the average American person?
Right. It's a good question, and it's a complicated one. And journalists were just like other Americans in the sense that some were initially even taken in a little bit about this new leader and this new movement and were less critical. Some were inclined to certainly underestimate its potential, but there were those who became really understood it and really tried to get it across. And they did that not only in their articles. I would dig through in the archives and get some of the messages they exchanged with their editors. And you see them arguing sometimes with their editors, say, you've got to give more attention to this story. It's what happens with journalists always. You know, everyone feels their story is the most important, but this was the most important story. And by the way, I should say one thing about American journalists in Berlin. In the 30s, when this was the big story, how many American journalists, full-time journalists, do you think would have been in Berlin? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Roughly, Mitchie? 50? Bingo. Bingo. That's amazing. That's the first time I've asked that question and somebody came up with the right answer. Most people, yeah, when I was in Berlin in the 80s, in Bonn in the 80s, and then in Berlin in the 90s, and it was a big story then, but, you know, probably full-time American journalists are maybe 15, 20. And I thought that was sort of the peak of the foreign correspondence era. Then there were 50 because every major American city had a newspaper. And a lot of them wanted to send correspondence there. There were various wire services that no longer exist. I mean, so there was a big presence and there was a range of views. But the good journalists often did feel frustrated. And I remember one of the diplomats came back, had gone to the States on leave, and came back and talked to the American journalists there who he considered to be the good journalists, who really understood it and been saying that you guys got to work harder. People in the States do not understand how dangerous this is. And the Americans who did often felt frustrated. Is that there's a lot of mention here in the film and elsewhere about the State Department officials who were very bureaucratic and often downplaying the dangers. But it was also often the regular public and editors and any number of people who were, but that doesn't, I think that only increases the significance of those who had both the perspicacity and the courage to try to tell that story.
Was the Jewish community in America not raising the alarm?
That's a good question too. It varied. I mean, many did try. For instance, in 1936, there was the Berlin Olympics, and many members of the Jewish community tried to organize a boycott. It wasn't only Jews, but especially Jewish leaders. And they came close to getting support for a boycott, but they didn't. And remember, in the 30s, anti-Semitism in this country was very strong too. Very famously, the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee was a guy called Avery Brundage. He came to Germany to look at what was happening, and there had been all this question, well, the Germans, can we send our athletes here? Is it a good idea? And there was this boycott movement. And of course, the Nazis showed him around and tried to get him, we have Jews training here and there. And, they had these showcase. And at one point, Brundage he goes around with a Nazi official to talk to Jews. So, how many local Jews are going to really tell him the truth, knowing that this guy's standing out right next to him? And at one point, he says to one of the Nazis, well, in my Chicago men's club, we don't allow Jews in either. There was, anti-Semitism was a fact of life in many countries, in this country too. Of course, not to the same extent. But Jewish groups, a lot of them were trying to organize, but it was a hard slog in those days. And then there was also the question of some Jews, for instance, famously the New York Times, which had a Jewish publisher, was a little afraid to be too strident, perceived to be too strident about this, not to say, that we don't want to be portrayed as a Jewish newspaper, on a one-issue newspaper. So the record of people standing up for this, there were people who really tried, but there were a lot of people who remained silent, and some of them, and the Jewish community was no different. There were people there were more people probably engaged, but there were also people who kept their heads down, fearing somehow an anti-Semitic backlash against them.
As a journalist, how do you believe the internet is going to affect journalism in the future?
How does what affect the
internet?
Oh, the internet. Oh, boy, that's a small question. You guys have another 2 hours or so? The internet I was actually, we were discussing this a little bit earlier. It's a mixed blessing. I mean, I love the fact that I can transmit quickly. When I started as a foreign correspondent, I would have to file. I'd write on a typewriter, of course, and I'd have to file on a telex machine, which anybody under the age of, do any of you know what a telex machine is? I don't think so. I think most of the older people, it's like a giant typewriter where you punched in this tape, and then it would get transmitted electronically to a London relay to the United States. It was a very cumbersome process. Any time during the week when there was a big story breaking, if I was going out to dinner someplace, I had to tell my editors, get the phone number of the restaurant or the place where I was going. And so, and the ease of communication is great. The downside, I think, is that, for one thing, sometimes the fact that as a foreign correspondent, I could tell them, I'm going to be out of touch for the next 3 days. For instance, I'm somewhere in the Russian hinterland. That was great, because I could just concentrate on reporting and collect real impressions. And you see these in the reporting of these American journalists, they taking these trips and really doing it, really getting into things in depth. With the internet, people, your editors expect you to be responding to almost every event momentarily, and often there's a huge amount of duplication. I used to teach a journalism course to students who wanted to write, and I'd say, look, when you study the internet, I remember there was a study of Google News, what stories they recycled. And during the day, and I think it was for a period of 24 hours, or maybe it was even a little longer, there were something like, I don't know, 14,000 stories that were cycled through to Google News. But if you trace those 14,000 stories, they came down to about 25 real news events or something different. Everything else was derivative, or people writing about something somebody else was writing. And, blogs, of course, are the classic, but it's not only blogs, and just repackaging. And I tell my students, you want to be the person writing the 27th, the 28th story, stuff that's original, that gives insights. And that's what the best journalists did, I think, in Germany then, in the Soviet Union later. They try to get out and get a perspective on things that matters. And I think in journalism these days, the pressure to just produce quickly, instantly, get clicks and so forth, can be detrimental to that. Now, at times it can allow for longer pieces, for insights, and of course the technology also of having video, direct video from events, from people who are there, can be our photos can be very, very valuable. But the whole economic model of journalism has changed. It used to be the advertisers had a few big outlets to focus on, which meant that you had big news operations with all sorts of checks and balances in them. A lot of that has disappeared, and journalism is now, it's definitely it's always a little bit in upheaval. It is now, and I think that it's going to take a while to sort out.
This is a two-part question. So in your research for the book, was there anything startling or significant that really stood out to you? And what part of writing Hitlerland was more challenging?
Okay. Startling and significant, I guess it was, one of the things was that whole story of Helen Hamstengel and how she prevented Hitler from committing suicide. At least she believed that. And I went in the Library of Congress. I found she died in the 70s, but I found an interview with her which was conducted by John Toland, who was an early Hitler biographer, and I listened to this interview, and you see in her voice, you hear in her voice, she claimed, oh, maybe I was a little bit, in awe of him, and I could see him as a rising star and starstruck, but then I became much more realistic. The way she talked about him, even as an older woman, you could see she still had this, I was in the presence of this big mega celebrity. So that startles you and say, how can anyone still, later in life, after knowing everything that happened, sort of be reveling in that? So those are the things that, and then there were little details. I mean, I talked about that whole period in the 1920s when Germany was this crazy place, and it was fun to dig into the personal archives. For instance, I found in Columbia University the records of, journalists sometimes leave records in their colleges or libraries. The personal papers of one of the journalists of that period, down to his expense reports. And in 1920s, I said, wow, he had a good expense account even then. I said, yeah, but that's rather trivial, but that's, as a journalist, you notice that stuff. But I guess what really comes across in all of this is, also the seriousness in which people were looking at the stories, but how often, yes, they got things wrong, and they were fallible. And again, for me, jumping a little back to Freud, to me, what made Freud so interesting was, aside from the fact, once he's this iconic figure, most of us think we knew something about Freud. I didn't know that much, really, until I started. He was a very human figure, a much warmer figure with a sense of humor than most people realize, but also how he got many of the big things right, but in his own life, how he got the big thing wrong, and that the danger that was closing in on him. And I think that's also very human. I think all of us, if you look back, any of us who've been in situations where suddenly there is real danger, and where the fundamental essential assumptions about how you're going to live your life change because everything around you is changing. I'm from Florida now. The hurricane. You think, it will miss me. But a political hurricane or something about it. We all have this tendency, I think, and I know I do too. You say, okay, there might be some danger here, but it's not really going to affect me, my family, until often it's too late. And that really comes through to me. That's the surprise to me, that even people I really believe Freud, whatever everyone thinks of his theories today, it was a hugely intellectual, consequential figure who shaped our whole concept of how we think, how we act, the whole notion of the subconscious and what guides our behavior. And yet he could get things about such a fundamental thing about his own life wrong. And that's in all of my research, that always, it's really interesting to see how people deal with the personal as well as that bigger picture.
You spoke about the perfect storm of the conditions, social, economic, political conditions that led to the rise of Hitler in Germany. I was wondering if you see parallels with any maybe current country.
What country would you have in mind? Now, that question comes up often, especially in conjunction with Hitlerland. I think I'm very wary of making direct parallels, because if you say, for instance, when there was the issue of the detention of people on the border, on the Mexican border, and people were saying, it's like the camps under Hitler. Give me a break. I mean, what it's doing is trivializing the concentration camps and the Holocaust. If you say first of all, if you say someone you don't like in politics, whether it's on the right or the left, is a fascist or a communist or so forth, you're ending all conversation. That's first. I still believe we are a democratic system. We have lots of failings, and there are lots of people and institutions that you can moan about, and justifiably. But I really dislike this quickification, putting on the quick label to just dismiss others. But there are issues. I'd say there are legitimate parallels and lessons. A lesson I would say from the rise of Hitler in particular is that when there is an extremist movement that really takes over, gets powerful, and takes over a country or an area of the world, and they are saying things which sound absurdly take them seriously. It's better to take it seriously and be proven wrong than not to take it seriously. So when, for instance, Iran says, we want to wipe Israel off the map, if I'm in Israel, I certainly take it seriously, but I think others should take it seriously too. Whether or not, in the end, what happens. So that's, I think, that's a lesson. And the other parallel, well, I mean, right now, you can't help, I mean, Putin is not Hitler, that's not the Nazis, but Putin's idea that Ukraine, for instance, is not a country, has no right to exist. When he started saying that stuff, take that seriously, and we've seen where it's gone. It's just like Hitler said, Czechoslovakia is not a country. And then we'll just take it to Sudetenland. And then, of course, everything else. So there are parallels, but I guess they're not exact parallels. And especially, but the big difference is, Putin is also a dictator and authoritarian. He may not be as totalitarian as the Nazis, but the big difference is, I think there are societies which still have opposition, functioning institutions, opposition parties, a press that, for all its failings, has various points of view. Be careful about equating that certainly with the Third Reich.
My question follows this lady's. I'm looking around and seeing the age of most of the people here. Do you find in your
it's under 25, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you find in your presentations, traveling around the country, that there's an interest from younger generations, and that they might, through what you share, become more aware of trends that may develop that could repeat something as awful as this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it is, of course, true that, as here, audiences who just come in tend to skew a little bit, not to be the youngest generations, but how many people in their 20s or even in their 30s or teenagers want to spend their Saturday afternoon here? But I do find there are people, for instance, I've spoken at the World War II Museum, and will be about my Freud book again in a couple of weeks. I'll be there even though he died in the first month of that World War II, but because he was so caught up in that period. And there I found that there are quite a few younger people, students and recent graduates, who seem to be carrying on the tradition of wanting to understand this period and are intensely interested in the new literature about it and new information. So it's, I think, only natural that people who feel a more direct connection to it, whose involvement, even by extension by their family, by their parents or grandparents, gives you a direct attachment to it. But I hope we aren't losing sight of this history. It's very recent history in historical terms. And it feels that way to me. I grew up with stories about this in my household, and since my parents went through it, and my grandparents went through it. I think, you don't have to have that immediate connection. It can be more distant and still find that interest. So, and also in schools, it's there. And I think these efforts by the Holocaust Museum and the World War II Museum and others to keep this history alive and not just consigned to the past are very, very worthwhile efforts.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you think the people in the countryside fared better than the people that were in the cities? Or did you see any kind of discrepancy of who was better off through the war?
Are you talking about in Germany or in the occupied lands or where?
Overall.
Well, I mean, in just materially, I mean, in the occupied lands, sometimes if you were on a farm, you might be a little bit better positioned to survive just because, especially when food became short, you might have more means to survive. But, you know, there were all sorts of fates of people. Because so many German men, young men, were serving in the military, aside from, there were all sorts of deportations. There were, of course, the deportations of Jews, in particular to the concentration camps, some of them who were at first put to work, but some later just straight to be killed. But there was slave labor. And for instance, my wife grew up in Poland. Her mother and father, both of them, were rounded up as teenagers, and my mother-in-law was sent to Vienna, in fact, and as a 16-year-old to work in a Swedish telephone company making field telephones for the German army. My father-in-law was sent to Germany to work on a farm because they had no farm hands. He was a Polish teenager. And some of those people survived, some of them did not. Who survived and who's not, that's another one of these things that where you were and what happened. I'll give you another example. In Poland, in that part of the world, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Germany, borders have shifted back and forth, and as armies and politics and wars took their toll. You have the famous saying, "I grew up in one village and lived in 5 countries." And that was pretty close to the truth in some cases. And I knew someone whose parents lived in an area which was right on that German-Polish area. One time it was German, one time it was Polish. And so when the occupation started, it was Polish at the time, the people who were considered ethnic Germans were told that you can register as an ethnic German, have better treatment, and then serve the new rulers. And many people refused, but this guy had 2 uncles. And one of them went into the Polish resistance, and the other one decided he'd have a better chance by registering as an ethnic German and serving in the German army. And guess which one survived? It was the guy who went into the Polish resistance, who you'd think would have the least chances of surviving. So life is full of choices and fates, and whether you were in the countryside or the city, things were pretty awful everywhere. And of course, later in the war, when the bombings got really intense, if you were, German cities and so forth had been sheltered from much of what had been happening elsewhere. But then at the end, the firebombing of Dresden, the bombing of Berlin, life did not become pretty for them either.
Was Wallace Simpson part of that 20s culture you talk about, being an American socialite, and did she expose the future king to these ideas, or?
Yeah, well, Wallace Simpson, who, as many of you know, was the cause why King George abdicated, King Edward abdicated, and some of you have probably seen some of the shows about her. She and her husband, the king who abdicated, began hobnobbing with some of the Nazis. And they were kind of, they were part of this group. There were people, there was in England too, sort of a pro-fascist element, and who sort of thought this was the new thing, fascism, and this was the glamorous future. Of course, they backed away from it later, but she was, let us say, I think, not a good influence on her husband, who was not the brightest bulb on the tree, politically or socially. And the reason he had to abdicate was because of her, and then the reason he became compromised in terms of his reputation, in terms of politically, was because of their flirtation with the Nazis.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we're done.
Good. Okay, thank you.